Hi, everybody. Let's do a little bit of thinking about history. This builds off the announcement that I posted recently called Time After Time. And I wanted to talk in a bit more detail about some of the points that I raised in that announcement. And I'm going to phrase this as I usually do. Okay, we're going to pause this for just a moment here. Hopefully my thing won't go away. That's good. I'll try and pause it in a less weird looking thing. I'll smile at you this time. Okay, so let's look at what we've got going on here. I just had to put these pictures up again. The first one is from the Isle of Wight, which is a British island off the coast of England. And these people are haying, bringing in the hay, something that, by the way, Laurie King mentions in The Beekeeper's Apprentice, or she has Mary Russell mention. And this is actually quite a famous photograph, Victorian photograph from the early 1900s, I believe. And I love it. It's just, the woman is so beautiful and so tousled. It's just neat. So a couple of things that I said in the announcement was I said the rewriting of history in the form of setting stories in times past is equally compelling. It's as compelling as history itself. In fact, it's a way of engaging with history and making history, and humanizing history that isn't always available to us when we're just kind of trying to gather the facts and things like that. Just as I did in the announcement, I'd like to go on and say, talk about this caveat. A caveat is where it's basically a warning, saying a beware. When I talk about history, I'm talking about something that doesn't exist in a very real sense. There isn't a history. There is a group of facts and observations and experiences and perceptions that are grouped together under this huge tent called history. And historians assemble pieces of that into narratives about what happened. But generally speaking, no one of those narratives captures the complete story. We kind of have to choose a point of view, a perception, and understanding. I'll give you an example. If you think about the Civil War, the American Civil War, how the history of the Civil War is told depends on a whole range of political, social, economic, emotional reactions and interactions that the teller of that history has. Even the perspective from which we tell a history, the history of the Civil War, matters tremendously. I mean, think about it. If you wanted to tell the history of the Civil War from the perspective of the mothers, sisters, daughters, and grandmothers who experienced it, that history would be completely different than if you were writing about how a slave experienced it. And even then, which slave and in what setting. So all I'm saying, I'm not saying let's go make a big fire and burn all the history books. I'm not saying that at all. The collection and creation of histories is one of the most fundamental human activities. We like to talk about what's happened. We learn a tremendous amount about a given culture by the way they talk about what happened. So I'm not trying to get rid of history, but what I'm trying to say is that there isn't any one history. We pick and choose. And so the way that we look at people going back into the past has to be informed by that fact. Okay, now I'm done doing that. I would suggest that rather than being sort of a depressing thing, this is actually a happy thing. Or it explains why we like to go back to history, why it's so interesting and compelling to us. It's that the historical record is negotiable. There's always stories in there that haven't yet been told or that have been forgotten and can be resurrected. Look at the interest in genealogy that we have, the way of trying to find our ancestors that we've lost. I think that this is one of the reasons why we're so interested in placing stories in back in time. It gives us an opportunity to think about history and to engage with it on a personal level, both as writers and as as readers too. Something that kept coming to my mind as I was thinking about history was the series of novels by a woman named Diana Gabaldon. These are romance novels. They're not. They're historical romance. Those of you who read romance novels and are familiar with the genre know that historicals are very, very big in that genre, much more so than in detective fiction. But then again, the historical novels do have a very important place. And one thing that comes to my mind is right away is Walter Mosley's series where he has a detective and it's set in 1950s and 60s Los Angeles. Just fascinating. And that's historical too. Even though it's the near past, it's still the past. And it's still renegotiating what that past meant and what it was like. Anyway, Diana Gabaldon is a scientist who decided that she wanted to write romance novels, and she started doing quite a bit of research. And so what she has is a time-traveling nurse. This woman who goes back into, she's visiting Scotland, and she goes back into 18th century Scotland and meets up with this guy who she falls in love with and who they have all these adventures, and then she gets jerked back into the present and she goes back and forth. Anyway, there are so many things that the author gets to do and gets to talk about that would be difficult to talk about if she were trying to just write a romance novel in the present. Anyway, I'm sorry, one of the focuses, Gabaldon's focuses, is trying to tell stories that weren't told, or that may have been half told, and to bring the conflict to life and from a modern perspective. So that's part of why I think this is so compelling to us, and I want to look at some of the other reasons why we do this. Now, the one I mentioned was very pragmatic. It's interesting to set our stories in the past simply because we have a lot more leeway. We don't get slammed if we're not true to the facts, or if we bend things to fit our story, and we can sort of make things possible without having people saying, well, that's not the way it was, that's not true. We're a lot more willing to bend the truth in the past than we are to deal with that in the present or the very, very near, the just past. And that can actually be quite an advantage when you come to the act of storytelling. Okay, what I think, but that's a pragmatic reason. I don't think that's a big reason, and yet it is very useful to the writer and to some extent to the reader, because the reader, being less familiar with the past, is able to kind of accept the story as it is told much more easily than we do in something that's told in the present time, because we're looking at stuff that's told in the present time and we keep going, hey, wait a minute, that's not real, that wouldn't happen. Okay. I think a more important and compelling reason, though, really is one that grows out of culture. And it's this idea of an inherent nostalgia. I sometimes feel like nostalgia is an endemic condition of being human, that we always long for what we don't have, for what we see as it being vanished. Back in the day, it was all good. Somehow the present time always seems to be flawed in some way. Or we look at the problems of the present time, and then we look at the past with this longing as if, well, if this problem wasn't present in the past, I'm sure, then times were necessarily better. Now, of course, you and I both know that that's usually a fallacy. In fact, it is a fallacy. There's no question about it. Times weren't better, ever. That's a terrible thing to say. But what I mean by it is each time has its flaws and its perils. No time is without them. And in no time in human history has there been a lack of conflict and disease and every other type of thing that you can imagine. It's true that we now have the opportunity to destroy the world itself in terms of nuclear capability, but for an individual or a family or a village or a country, we still see that vast swaths of humanity have always been in danger of annihilation. So I guess, you could make the argument that while it's terrible that, or that you could of course easily make a pretty profound argument that the annihilation of all humankind is, geometrically more terrible than the annihilation of certain groups within that. But to the people who experience it, it really is 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Okay, so but nonetheless, I mean, we have this idea of the good old days, times where men were men and women were women, and everybody knew their place. People had values. Life was simpler. Communities lived in harmony. Individuals were more in touch with spirituality, nature, what mattered. There's the whole fantasy, magic, witchcraft thing. That seems, if you put your story in a time that is somehow different from our own and a distance from our own, we get to have a lot more leeway in terms of who shows up in our stories as well. And romance, honor, and chivalry weren't dead. What I love about this is that there's a tremendous tension between our perception of the past and knights in shining armor and all that kind of stuff, and the reality of love relationships in the past. The actual, many of you are probably aware of this, but the idea that people married for love is a very, very recent one. Now, the idea that people had sex for love is not a recent one. But the idea that you would get married and that you would that was what marriage and relationships were about, that's extremely new. I mean, that's probably that being put into practice is maybe 300 years old. It's not. I mean, if you look at why and how people got married and when they got married and all this kind of stuff, you really see that that's not how people really did it. They got married for one reason, and it was basically a business proposition. I shouldn't say basically. It was much more of a business proposition, and your expectations of it involved the business of having a family and perpetuating your family, much more than it was the idea that it was this romantic thing. It takes money and safety to turn one's attention to make the primary way that you perpetuate your group, your family, your clan, your village, your country, to make that a function of romance rather than of practicality and pragmatism. And that kind of security and prosperity is really a function for the mass of people, is really a function of the last 200-300 years. And even there, I mean, you may be looking at more like 100 years or less. You have to really, I mean, it's worth thinking about the world that Peters presents to us, where really people of privilege were this teeny tiny group within the macrocosm of people. Most people didn't have much of anything, and were kind of this giant base on a pyramid with a very small top. The emergence of a middle class is something that really only starts in the late Middle Ages, and then in it gets in full swing in the Renaissance. But the middle class as the majority doesn't really happen until even in the 19th century. That's an emerging class. It's really the 20th century where you see that. All right, long digression, but I guess I'm bringing some of this up to give you a sense of we have a way of romanticizing the past that is not true to what the historical record, whatever one you pick, tells us. Okay. There's a wonderful book, by the way, that I highly recommend. It's one of my favorites of all time. It's called A Distant Mirror. That's A Distant Mirror, and it's by Barbara Tuchman. And she writes about the 13th century in England and France, which is, the 13th century was when the plague emerges. And it's absolutely fascinating. She does what's called cultural history, which talks about the lives of the common people during that time. And it really illustrates some of what I'm trying to tell you about the past and how complex history itself is. Okay, so we're suggesting that we have this kind of nostalgia, and that's one of the things that makes it appealing to set a story in the past. Nostalgia costs very little, and the reimagining of the past through the lens of the present allows us a potent kind of wish fulfillment based in what we feel is lacking or lost in our modern lives. And I want to stress that point, the reimagining of the past through the lens of the present. And I say this because think about what Ellis Peters does to talk about the 11th century in a way that a modern reader will understand. She does it so well that it's easy to forget sometimes how this isn't the way that people in the 11th century talked about themselves. This isn't the way they thought of their world. This is a modern presentation of that time. One way I wanted to, or one place where that's really evident is how people talk. Peters does a masterful job of having the characters speak in a way that presents the expectations of that time, and yet is modern enough that we're not turned off or alienated. I mean, if we actually were teleported back into the 10th century, the chances are we wouldn't understand the people who are talking to us. First of all, a lot of them would be speaking French. There would be a good deal in the, if you were, there would be a good deal of Welsh, obviously, if we were back in those days. But the way that people spoke English was very different. Remember that if you look at the writing, Chaucer's writing, if you've ever had that opportunity and you look at it in the original, you need a translation to really understand it until you get a handle on Middle English. So I just, or if you read Beowulf, which is in Old English, well, heaven help you then. There's this translation that's going on. The translation is taking our modern eyes and looking back and finding a way to talk about what's going on there in a way that a modern audience understands. Okay, so that's that piece about the reimagining of the past through the lens of the present. And one of the reasons I'm making such a point of this is it's worth recognizing the author's craft and what it takes to be able to tell this kind of story, to place your story in the past. Okay, next point. As is true with science fiction and fantasy writing, setting stories in a different temporal location, in other words, in another place and time, makes many things possible and believable that aren't and wouldn't be if a story were set in whatever time is contemporary for a given author. I want to give you an interesting example. Well, it's interesting to me anyway. Example of this. As I have mentioned several times, I am a wannabe novelist. I write genre fiction, and as I was getting ready to write the mystery novel that I'm working on now, I thought I'd try my hand at writing a romance novel. And there was an opportunity to send some of what I had written in this romance novel off to an editor, and paid a little bit of money, and they, commented on my plot. And one of the things I had happening was basically a marriage of convenience. Marriage of convenience is where the two people don't love each other, but they get married because it is politically and financially advantageous. And then if it's a romance novel, then they end up falling in love anyway. Well, my novel is set in present-day Chicago. It's called Payment Due, by the way. And it has basically an arranged marriage between these two people. The man proposes to the woman. He says, I want to get married, I want to have kids, and I want to have somebody who is of my own ethnic background. They're both Latinos. And he's very wealthy. She used to be very wealthy, but all the money has been lost, so she agrees to, for reasons that I won't bore you with, she agrees to this arranged marriage. So the comment that I got from the editor, a lot of different comments, but one of the comments was, well, you can't have these people doing this. Arranged marriage is so 19th century. Okay, so this is, it's a great illustration of this point, that if I had said it in the 19th century or before, and she wouldn't even have batted an eyelash that there was an arranged marriage in this story. However, because I chose to set it in modern times, that isn't as easy of a sell. Okay? Now, those first three reasons for setting things in the past really aren't much of a stretch. But I'd like to push this a little bit farther. And I'd like to say that, I think of the past, of history, as a kind of other. It's remote and unknowable, and that gives it a glamour, a menace, and an exotic foreignness. We want to colonize it. We want to control it. It's so hard to understand what happened. What made us as we are, what made our world the way it is, that we are interested in and compelled to go back and make it ours, to update it, to control it. Think about what Peters does. She takes us back to an 11th century that, although it is fraught with danger, early death, treachery, short lives, religious, the absolute penetration of religion in every part of life, the world she presents is a world that is controllable, it's understandable. Everything comes out all right in the end, even for the people who die or are injured. Somehow there's this sense that there's this overarching protectiveness. There's something that, this is a world under control. The things that the people face in these novels are understandable to us, and in comparison to our modern mind, in comparison, are things we can contemplate without the same kind of horror. And in a way, in the distant historical perspective, we know if we look at, if we see our modern day life as somehow an advancement on the 11th century, we also have this sort of long view feeling that everything turned out all right. Okay? But when we colonize the past with our stories, we bring it under control, we contain it, and we shape it to our own ends. I think that's, to an extent, that's also true about what King is doing in her colonization of the home story. And I'm sorry, I've used this term colonize a couple of times. And we talk about, there's many ways of colonizing. We can get together, get on a ship and sail over to another country and set up shop and say, well, this is where we live now. And this is our colony, we claim it. In the name of Spain, I claim this, or whatever. So that's a way of colonizing. But we can also colonize things culturally. When we take over a history, an art form, when we appropriate it and we turn it to our own uses, we are colonizing it. We are we are living in it and adapting it to our needs. King wants to change the home story. She wants to make it different, and she wants to shape it to her own needs. I'm not complaining about this at all. I'm not saying this is bad. I'm just saying this is part of what's going on. It leads to, in both the case of Peters and in the case of King, it leads to wonderful stories. By and large, the portrait of the Catholic Church and monastic life that Peters offers us is very sanitized and very positive. You can bet your bottom dollar that not every monastery was like that. not every monk was like that, and that the excesses and abuses that occurred in by the church and in the church and through the church are were pretty rife. Again, I refer you to the novel, the history. It is a collection of history called The Distant Mirror to get a sense of some of the things that were going on there. Although here again, Peters is casting this back pretty far before the 13th. We got 200 years before the 13th century, so we're doing pretty good. And she might argue that the bureaucracy is a little less abusive at that time. But be that as it may, Peters is giving us a pretty darn positive, overall positive idea. There's the sense, of kind of one of the subtexts of Peters' novels about Brother Cadfael is that there may be people who are bad. There are individuals who are bad. But the institution itself is good, particularly at the idea that there is some beauty and harmony and balance in the rituals and the practice and, to some extent, the hierarchy that's involved in this, and that the function of religion and the religious within the community that she presents is overall a positive one. Now, to some extent, that was true, depending on where you were and at the time. I mean, really, particularly if you start going back into the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, the churches were really some of the only places where learning and art and science continued during the bad old days. But, obviously there's so much more to the story and so many ways of telling that story. But Peters gets to go back and kind of colonize that history and make it seem as something positive. Now, I am in no way running down Peters and what she does, because I actually really love the Brother Cadfael novels. I see her as she's a writer of popular fiction. And she's not aiming too high. She wants to write books that are entertaining and interesting and involve a place she loved very much. She very much loved Shrewsbury and lived in and around it for much of her life. And I've read, I would say, 2/3 of the over 20 Brother Cadfael books and enjoyed them very much, even though, as you go on, you get a sense of the limitations. Her books always unfold in pretty much the same way. There's a crime. The person suspected of the crime is not really the person who did the crime. There are young lovers, or sometimes older lovers, and they get together. But there's also some really interesting subtexts that go along with it that keep you reading and keep you fascinated. The other thing that she does, which I think is really fascinating, is when she goes back to work her way on this period in time and to kind of generate her own little subhistory. When she goes back, she uncovers some really cool things. She was a very meticulous researcher, and the things that she writes about that Brother Cadfael uses, the cures that he uses, the understanding that he has of the human body and things like that, those are real. Those are things that if you were to read about herbalism or the practice of herbal medicine back in the Middle Ages, you would find a lot of these things. She also, I think, uncovers something that's really interesting, which is how much can be understood and deduced from a very small amount of evidence. And how the understanding of the natural world and the functions of the body still allowed much of what of the basics of detecting to go on. And you see this, I mean, as you read more of these, you see different elements brought up. Okay, so I've talked about this, bringing something under control, and she really does. I mean, this is a pretty sanitized version of the Middle Ages, but I want to go back to King, who I started talking about, and then jump back again to Peters. But I want to talk about King and what she does. There is a sense in this that she takes Holmes and she forces him to be human. She doesn't violate or overwrite what Conan Doyle gave us. But she adds to it in so many different ways that he becomes, and it's a word I used in the, that I used below, she sexualizes him and makes him a physical being in a way that he isn't in Conan Doyle's stories. He gives him feelings and emotions that are above and beyond, although they are natural extrapolations of what Conan Doyle gave us. They're above and beyond what she gives us. And she basically gives him a romantic life. Now, I understand that you're going, what romance? Come on, I don't see any kissing, There's a little bit of hugging, some hugging and hand kissing, but there's no, they're not making out. But still, she goes back and she takes back these stories. She reappropriates these stories and makes them a collaborative effort. It will probably not come as a surprise. In other words, a collaboration. Instead of Holmes being the guy in control and Watson being the bumbling, well, he is still a bumbling fool, but a dear one. She gives him an equal and a foil in a woman. She undertakes the task of saying, what happens what would happen if, okay? And I'm gonna come back to that what would happen if thing in a moment. But here again, what we see is the author is going back into history and into a specific text and rewriting it, remaking it. The other thing I was going to say is we place narratives in the past to have a chance of telling stories that were not told during that time. And I said, remember the position women have in Conan Doyle's England. They are primarily frail furniture, servants, victims, or agents of evil. They do not have an equal role in detecting or resolving mysteries. The very thought of their doing so would have been shocking to Conan Doyle. King revisits this history and performs an intervention. She places a woman at the heart of the story and changes the story profoundly by so doing, even as she honors the previous tellings of the story. I wanted to talk about this a little bit before I go on to the to kind of the conclusion of this. And I hope you forgive me for talking about my own work. I have mostly kept it out just because it wasn't relevant. But the detective novel that I'm working on now is called Sainthood. And the reason I'm talking about it to you now is because of how I came to start to develop the plot. I had read two things that affected me profoundly. One was the Da Vinci Code. And I mentioned this at the very beginning. I hated that book so much. And yes, I know everybody else in the known universe loved that book. But I just hated it, and it made me so furious because, well, for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons it made me furious was because I felt he was a crappy writer. And I was like, why can't I be that crappy? The guy is, richer than Methuselah. Wait, no, that's the guy who was a long time. But he's richer than Midas. And this is horrible. I don't believe the characters. It sounds like he visited Paris on a street map. He wasn't really there. He's not describing it. Blah blah blah. Okay, that's my complaint about the Da Vinci Code. But my other problem with it, or my other issue was, I was like, well, I want to write a mystery that is well written. Maybe I can do that. I don't know. I still don't know. But the other problem that I had was, why does the thing that the person, why does this have to be, if somebody finds this historical document, why does it have to be like the book that will kill you, or here's the secret that's going to rip the lid off the Catholic Church, or why does it have to be a big deal? Why can't they just find some historical document and have it not be a big deal? But still there was a mystery. Okay, so that was my issue with the Da Vinci Code. Combined with that was I have a writing group, and I was saying, I'm having trouble writing romantic scenes. I'm embarrassed. And one of the people in my writing group said, oh, you should try this writer. And she handed me a Harlequin novel. And she said, this person writes really good romantic scenes. By romantic, I mean sex, okay? Enough said. And I'm not talking about pornography. I'm just talking about, you have to describe people being intimate. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that. Okay, so I read this book, and I was so frustrated by the book because the hero is this big macho man with lots of muscles, and the woman is this frail, fainting, trembling creature. And I was like, I want to write a book where the people are normal and they look like me and my friends, not like superheroes and models. What would happen if I wrote a book like that? And this is where we come back to what I was talking about, that so much of writing is the what if, that you ask yourself, what if? So the plot of Sainthood, in this case, I was saying, well, what if you have this person who finds a manuscript and she's a normal person, I mean, she's an average person, and what if there's still a mystery? And so the story of Sainthood is that a medievalist finds some letters from a woman who's an anchorite. An anchorite was anchorites were people who basically had themselves walled up in churches. I don't mean like the Telltale Heart or something like that, but they would live in a little cell in a church and basically look out, and that they were like monks, but they lived alone, and people would feed them and stuff like that. But she finds a letter of this anchorite named Julian of Norwich. That's a real person, and soon after and it's a big find, it's really cool, but the letters are just talking about her daily life, and there's nothing, like no great secret in them or anything, but it's a very exciting find because we don't have that many letters from medieval people. Generally, only the rich wrote letters, and they were generally business letters. They weren't really personal. They tended to be more formal. But the other thing is that they didn't write diaries. That the idea of writing in a diary is something that doesn't come along. So anyway, my historian, it's set in Boston and Florence, Italy, but my historian, who's a woman named Drusilla White, is going to a conference to reveal these letters, and there's the blah blah blah. But anyway, she starts getting threatened and told that if she goes, she'll be anonymous threats, that if she goes, she's going to be killed. And so this leads to a whole series of other plot things. But it was the what if, right? And I think that history brings out the what if in authors. It makes authors, it excites authors, and it excites, I think it excites all of us as readers, because it gives us this chance, once again, to go back. Now, to go back and sort of live our lives differently, think of our lives differently. Well, what if I were living in this era? What would my life be like? Okay, so whatever the reasons an author has for setting the dial on the time machine to, in the olden days, that choice sheds light on the author's culture's relationship to history. It could be argued, and I did argue, that Peter's retreat to the Middle Ages suggests a quest for a reality where some of the existential angst of the 20th century is in abeyance, where the questions and sufferings are at least different and viewed in a different context. It could be argued that King's retreat to Conan Doyle is a quest to bring modern feminism back to the days when it was in its first difficult and contentious flowering. Interestingly enough, as The Beekeeper's Apprentice is the first of, I believe, 10 novels that feature Mary Russell and Sherlock Holmes. And in the later novels, she gets involved with radical feminism. As women are fighting for the vote, there's a wing of feminism where women are going, we're not going to take this anymore. We need to have the vote. We need to have equal rights. We need to be able to have control over our money. And some women resorted to violence and killing themselves, blowing things up. This is more kind of at the turn of the century that there was a big outbreak of this. But still, Mary Russell had some involvement with that. And I think, it's this idea where in the modern era, the idea that a man and a woman could be equal partners in an undertaking, that a man might perceive a woman as intellectually, if not physically, his equal. It isn't that crazy. Does it happen all the time? Nah, of course not. But the idea that men and women are, at least to an extent, equal isn't a completely foreign one to us. What it seems as if King might be wanting to do is to basically carry that reality back to a time when it was almost inconceivable. And to have that reality present in a time when it was not. So I think that, kind of to wrap this up, as we look at what's going on in the retelling of history in the context of the detective novel, we see there's a lot at play. It's a very rich topic to talk about, and I really appreciate your time as I talked at length about it. I hope you have a wonderful